Welcome, everyone. My name is John Kagia, and I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer here at New Frontier Data, and we are absolutely thrilled to have you join us this afternoon for the third in this three-part webinar series focused on the hemp market. In this afternoon's discussion, we're going to be focused on the future of minor cannabinoids. So for all of the discussion that we've seen over the past few years about CBD, about THC, we feel like there's been really little kind of appreciation or exploration of the potential opportunity that minor cannabinoids represent. And so that will be the focus of our conversation this afternoon. And to join us in that conversation, we have two just phenomenal experts on the hemp sector, on cannabis, the plant, and on the science and the innovation that's driving both the innovation and opportunities that this sector represents. We'll be joined by Dr. Jonathan Vaught, CEO and co-founder of Front Range Biosciences, and Steve Groff, the founder of Groff North America, who are our sponsors for this webinar series. Now, for those of you who don't know Groff North America, Groff is a physician-owned cannabis company focused on cultivating, processing, and packaging medical-grade cannabis. They process and refine cannabis for its beneficial compounds and materials, both to further benefit people and to benefit the planet. Groff North America specializes in science-based custom cannabinoid formulations to meet both consumer and market needs. Now, Pharmacy Health, which is a subsidiary of Groff North America, is an integrated health system built around the science and application of cannabis as a medicine. Pharmacy Health is led by experienced physicians, researchers, and practitioners who focus on the advancements of medicine, treatment, and community health through the use of cannabis and its constituents. So Steve, thank you to you and the team for just being such great partners through this hemp webinar series and for sharing your phenomenal perspective on the advancements in this space.
Glad to be here and be part of it.
For our agenda today, for those of you who've joined us for webinars in the past, you know that we have a fairly set process by which we run these. We'll begin by allowing our speakers to introduce themselves. We'll do a quick poll with you, our attendees, so we can get a sense of who we have joining us for this conversation, as well as to understand your perspectives on this ecosystem. And then we'll get into the conversation, delving into the future of minor cannabinoids and what opportunities are emerging for cannabinoids beyond CBD and THC, reserving plenty of time for audience questions, both through the course of the conversation that we're going to be having and specifically during the Q&A period following the initial conversation that the doctors and I are going to be having. Now, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, we always get this question as we're getting into these webinars. Yes, you will receive a copy of both the deck and the recording of this session, so don't feel like you have to fiercely scribe. We're going to be covering a lot of ground. We're going to be moving fairly quickly. So feel free to kind of pay attention to the conversation as you'll have access to all of these materials after we are done. And then second, in your attendee bar, in the nav bar on your screen, you should see a Q&A panel there. Please start inputting your questions for us as we go along. Don't feel like you have to wait until the Q&A portion. We do weave your questions into the discussion that we're having. And it also makes it easier for us to aggregate questions into thematic groups so that we're answering as many of them as we can get through. So please, get those questions in and we'll work as aggressively as we can to answer as many of them as possible. So with that, we'll get started. By way of introduction, as I said, my name is John Kagia. I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer here at New Frontier Data. And for those of you who don't know us, New Frontier Data is a research, data, and analytics firm focused exclusively on the legal cannabis industry. We've been doing this for nearly 6 years, beginning first with the medical and adult use sides of the market. But about 3 years ago, through our acquisition of the Hemp Business Journal, began to really focus in on the dramatic opportunities that we saw emerging in the global hemp sector. As a market research analyst for my entire career, We've had the privilege of studying a broad range of sectors, from emerging tech to financial services markets to war fighting technologies. And across the spectrum of sectors, across the spectrum of industries that we've looked at, I've never seen anything that has grown as quickly, faced the level of kind of disruptive innovation, or presented the sorts of opportunity, the level of wealth creation opportunity that we've seen in cannabis. And I'm particularly excited about this question about minor cannabinoids, simply because, as the cannabis industry both grows and matures, as we begin to understand much better the principal cannabinoids, THC and CBD, we feel like, the minor cannabinoids present this kind of new, significantly untapped opportunity. And so really excited to explore with our two doctors today the opportunities that these minor cannabinoids represent, and understanding where they fit more broadly within this highly dynamic cannabinoid ecosystem that we're all paying attention to. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jonathan Vaught, CEO of Front Range Biosciences. John, please introduce yourself to our attendees.
Yeah, thank you, John. Happy to be here. And so I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders at Front Range Biosciences. And before I started Front Range Biosciences, I spent about 15 years developing new technologies in the molecular diagnostic space, mostly in the human clinical side, supporting early diagnosis and monitoring of chronic illness, things like cancer, heart disease. I did my PhD work in organic chemistry at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I also spent a couple of years developing similar technologies in food safety for detecting foodborne pathogens. Along the way, I started a 501c3 nonprofit here in Boulder called Mountain Flower Dairy. It's a small goat dairy focused on educating the community around agriculture and food production and sustainability. And I kind of fell in love with agriculture and wanted to shift my career more in that direction. And that was really marked the birth of Front Range Biosciences about 5 years ago. My co-founders and I got together and decided that this is probably one of the most exciting areas of agriculture in at least in the last 100 years, and that cannabis is a really remarkable plant that has incredible use applications, between medical uses and ingredients to protein and food production, and then even industrial applications like fiber. So we set out to build a company that in Front Range Biosciences that was really focused on the very beginning of the agricultural supply chain in cannabis. And so we're leveraging technologies like tissue culture, molecular assisted breeding or marker assisted breeding, and other next generation breeding technologies to really develop new cannabis varieties and improve the types of traits that they display, whether it's things like minor cannabinoids, which we're going to talk about today, or even agronomic traits, things like growth habit or pest resistance or the ability to tolerate drought conditions. Yeah, we work in both hemp and cannabis. We also have a business unit that does similar work in coffee breeding and nursery development. And excited to be here. We've got a lot of exciting things to talk about today in minor cannabinoids. This is an area of research that's very, very close to the heart for our company, and a lot of the work that we're doing in terms of breeding, both for cannabis and hemp.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here, John. And I just have to say, I know science has been the deep undercurrent across your career, but I always smile on just kind of the thought of going from cancer pharmaceutical research to goat farming to cannabis plant genetics. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's a pretty diverse background. Everybody always gets a kick out of the goat farm story, but yeah, it's been a great journey. And I really believe that cannabis represents a really amazing intersection of agriculture and medicine and food and ingredient production. And so it was quite a journey to get here, but I'm happy to be here now.
It's a privilege to have you here, so thank you for being here. Steve, not only founder of Groff North America, but you've been the sponsor of this three-part series, which I think the discussion has just been phenomenal for. Steve, please introduce yourself to our attendees today.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be here again, and I'm going to echo some of the same themes that Dr. Vaught did. I grew up on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania, milking cows, and while I enjoyed that life and learning that work ethic, I didn't want to do it the rest of my life. I ended up becoming an orthopedic surgeon. I've been a physician here in Pennsylvania for 29 years, mostly as an orthopedic surgeon. I was blessed to develop an entire health system based around orthopedics, and had a great run there, and was almost killed in a bicycle crash a few years back. I'm lucky, I'm alive and well, and took a big turn in life. And within a few years, I ended up in this space, and can't agree more with both of you that this is a great intersection of ag, farming, pharma, marketing, and it kind of feels like the right place for myself, my family, and a great team we've built out. So very excited to be part of this exploding industry, and bringing a science and medical, bringing a traditional medical background into it. And but I'm looking to sort of increase that overlap between the understanding of cannabis and traditional medicine, because I think we should overlap a lot more. And so I'm proud to be heading that up.
Awesome, awesome. Well, a delight to have you here, and thank you for your sponsorship of this series. So for the audience, as we said, we'll be launching a poll question, which will a series of poll questions, 5 questions, which are going to appear on your screen right now. Please take a couple of minutes to answer these questions. We will share the results with you in detail at the end of the webinar, but this is really helpful to us to help us better understand both who we have here, as well as your orientation to the topic today of minor cannabinoids. So the poll questions should be up on your screen now. Please take a couple of minutes to answer these questions. Thank you to those who've responded. We will not be keeping these up through the course of the webinar, so please get them answered while they are up. We'll give you maybe another 70 seconds or so. Interesting. Very interesting to see the spread of responses that we've already received. Another 30 seconds or so, so please, for those of you who've not responded yet, take a moment. And we assure you your answers will not be used against you. This is completely anonymous. We'll give you another 10 seconds or so.
Yeah, I am. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone who took a moment to answer those questions. We'll look forward to sharing these results with you at the end of the session. Much appreciated. Now, before we get into the deep discussion about the cannabinoids, I want to take just a moment for Steve, given the breaking news that you shared with us just before this webinar, which I think is really exciting for what it represents for the future of research of cannabis. Could you share with our attendees, what you've been working on and what the recent FDA ruling means for the advancement of science writ large and your role in advancing some of the cannabinoid research that you're going to be working on?
Sure, John. As I entered this space, one of my frustrations was the challenge of the 0.3 and struggles in that regard. And I really wanted to be able to study the entire plant, the cannabis plant in itself, and not worry about the delineation of hemp and marijuana, and really just focus on high or low THC cannabis. And in that effort, I realized that the DEA was going to be changing some of the ways that bulk cultivation is done here, and the availability of cannabis for pharmaceutical or medical purposes. And so along the way, I have registered with the DEA and the FDA as a Schedule I researcher. And for better or worse, right now at the federal level, anything with THC above 0.3 is considered marijuana and a Schedule I, meaning it has no medical benefits. And we know that that's not the case, but it's going to take a while to get that changed. But in the meantime, there's an opportunity to, the DEA and HSS know that they want to advance the opportunity for research with cannabis. And up until now, the University of Mississippi, of course, is the only source of federally legal cannabis, and there's been a bunch of challenges with that. So this new program is about to be released, and we've been pursuing it. And as part of that, I submitted a project to the FDA and DEA using cannabis and studying the antimicrobial aspects in both a bench and an animal trial. It's non-human trial. But the FDA recently approved this, as well as the DEA, and that's a huge first step towards this opportunity to not only complete this research project with marijuana or high THC cannabis, but also obtain the opportunity to grow and bulk cultivate cannabis. So it's expected any day now the DEA is going to release a final rule on cultivation for research and manufacturing, and we're excited to be part of that. So,
well, congratulations. This is a major milestone, not I think just for Groff North America, but I think for the industry at large. And just quick orientation for those who may not be familiar. Advancing federally approved research in cannabis has been historically phenomenally challenging, in part because the only source by which you could procure that cannabis has been the University of Mississippi. And for those who may have been following, for example, the challenges that Dr. Sue Cicely was facing with the cannabis-based project that she was trying to advance with veterans, one of the big challenges with relying on the University of Mississippi was just the quality of cannabis that the institute was producing was very poor and was taking a phenomenally long time to produce. At the time, the federal government's position was that they would not allow commercial providers to supply research that was going to be used for federally funded research, but they were also not allowing anyone outside of the University of Mississippi to apply for licenses or permits to produce the research to advance that science. So to hear that not only are they starting to permit non-University of Mississippi institutions to advance to produce research to supply these studies, but also allowing these studies to advance with federal government blessing, I think represents the at least first crack of what has been a major dam to advancing US-based cannabis research. So congratulations to Steve and the team for being pioneers here.
Thanks. And just to be clear, we expect any day the final rule on the bulk cultivation, and we are already been pre-registered for that. What we were approved for is the Schedule I researcher designation, and the FDA approved the project that I submitted. So, but those are prerequisites to obtain the bulk permit. So just to be clear, and this is something that's been 4 or 5 years in the works. The DA first mentioned this in 2016, and then Jeff Sessions came into office as Attorney General. It was basically shelved for 4 years, and so it's been a long time coming, and certainly beyond that. But we're excited to be at the forefront here.
And just one question about the research that you're going to be doing. Is the antimicrobial an ingestible, or is it going to be a topical?
So it's starting with a bench study looking at different cannabinoids effectiveness against staph MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, a notorious pathogen as well as E. coli 0157, a gram-negative pathogen, both of which have challenges with antimicrobial, with antibiotics sometimes becoming ineffective. Those bugs become resistant. And so there is some early evidence that a number of the cannabinoids have antimicrobial effectiveness, but we want to delineate it much more clearly and specifically against these two bad bugs.
Who would have thought that amongst the spectrum of applications for which cannabis is being deployed, going after superbugs would be on the list as well?
Very exciting.
So then, perhaps then, given that the wheels of science are turning around cannabis research, a perfect segue to begin this conversation around what the primary minor cannabinoids are and what their potential applications they could be used towards. So if we're talking about, there's probably 5 which people are broadly familiar with, and or at least which seem to be gaining the most traction amongst the research and scientific community. You have the 2 variants of CBG, CBG and CBGA, which have slightly different applications, although with CBG being broadly applied toward inflammation, or seemingly to have strong potential for inflammation, CBGA showing some promise for Crohn's disease, CBC being applied toward osteoarthritis, THCV being looked at both for diabetes as well as for its appetite suppressant properties, and CBN, which seems to have some promise for glaucoma. Now, these are just initial early indications from the science that has been done to date. But maybe to both John and Steve, I'd love to hear your perspectives on these minor cannabinoids. For somebody for those who may not have paid any attention to the minor cannabinoid ecosystem, or trying to understand where these cannabinoids fit within the industry. Talk a bit about these minor cannabinoids, the promise that they represent, and where the science currently sits.
I'd like to make one real general question, and I'll let Dr. Vaught go into more detail about each one. But I think the point I like to bring across is that the observations you made are just that they're very early observations. And despite maybe the social media community and some of the things we're seeing, like, it's important to know that while I agree that those observations certainly have promise, it is extremely early for any of the minor cannabinoids. That doesn't mean they don't hold tremendous promise, but it's incredibly early across the board. But John, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to kick it off, Dr. Groff. It's an important point. I mean, I think we need double-blind, clinical data, to really make the kinds of connections, to some of these disease states. But I think we're well along the way, and certainly in other countries, there are folks that are generating that data, and we're certainly, as you mentioned earlier, you're well on your way to getting started on some of that work as well. But yeah, I think the way we view minor cannabinoids is really once again from the agricultural perspective and a plant breeding perspective. And when you think about minor cannabinoids, cannabinoids in general are a class of compounds that are basically a secondary metabolite in cannabis, and the ones up here are somewhat related to each other. They all have very chemical structures, and they're generated in the plant through different biochemical pathways. And some of them are precursors to the other. Some of them have what we call promiscuous enzymatic activity in the plant, where an enzyme that's supposed to produce THC, for example, it produces a little bit of CBD, or vice versa, and things like that. So we're developing a pretty strong understanding of these biochemical pathways, but it is still very early, not only on the clinical side, but in the plant side as well, and really understanding the underlying biology behind production of these minor cannabinoids. I think it's important to note that there's well over 100 that have been identified, And you know, and this just represents a handful that are easily accessible and relatively easily detected in the plant currently. You know, and THC is obviously the most well-known cannabinoid, and everybody's very familiar with that. And then CBD, you know, recently it became fairly well-known as well. But you know, all of these different cannabinoids are expected to have, and some even have data to support it, but some level of activity to receptors in the endocannabinoid system. So it's, you know, I think there is a lot of promise for these compounds, both as potential drug candidates, but I think also as wellness ingredients, you know, for wellness applications, dietary supplements, even food additives at some point. And I think, you know, it's important to, you know, to keep in mind that there's, you know, multiple regulatory pathways to get these out into the market. So, so anyway, so I hope that gives a little bit of background. You know, we're certainly producing and breeding for all of these different minor cannabinoids in our program. And, you know, the challenging thing with cannabis, I think, is that unfortunately, due to prohibition for the last 50, 60 years, it's really been bred for one thing, to produce high levels of THC. And so we've actually lost a lot of genetic diversity over the years, you know, by not providing access to, you know, proper tools and breeding technologies and diversity in the germplasm. And so, you know, it's actually hard to find some of these minor cannabinoids in the existing plants that are out there. And so that's something that we spent a lot of time working on. And, you know, I'm pleased to say that a lot of these are going to become, I think, more and more available, you know, from plant breeding and from the plant itself, to support some of the clinical work that needs to be done.
So there may be a two-part question for you, both of you. You know, which one of these do you think the science is most advanced on, or kind of has begun to show, has been affirmed for at least some of the early indications that we are understanding that this is very, very early days across the board? And then the second part, which is a personal question to each of you, which is, which one of these or other minor cannabinoids are you most excited by the potential it could represent based on the very, very early science?
Go ahead, Dr. JV.
So, yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of the science at the plant level, you know, I think we understand CBG fairly well. It's early in the pathway, so CBG is you know, generally a precursor to some of these other compounds, and so I think we understand it reasonably well. You know, the varins, or the THCV, which are basically propyl cannabinoids, it's a modified version of all of the other cannabinoids, and there's not only THCV, but there's CBDV, and you know, and I think be able to produce at some point CBGV, and so, and CBCV. So, so yeah, but I think that one's probably the most well known. And I think from a plant breeding perspective, CBG is the one that's also, you know, that's most available that we saw in the hemp market this year. You know, we had several varieties that we put out in the market, and as well as several other breeders did, and nursery companies as well. And, you know, in terms of what's the most exciting, it's really tough to say from a clinical indication perspective. I think, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I think all of these are actually going to be relevant, and, you know, especially in the dietary supplement wellness category. And then I think as medicinal chemists get a hold of some of these compounds and begin to do some medicinal chemistry on them, I think we're going to see, you know, huge libraries of really interesting cannabinoid-based drugs getting into the pipeline as well.
I like that, libraries. That's I love that. That's our concept as well. I think the bottom line is we don't know enough. I would share again that enthusiasm. I've seen some early things that are tremendously exciting about a number of these things, but part of the challenge in the cannabis world, and like I refer back to social media, and I'm part of that. You know, there's such enthusiasm, and we want that, but I'm not trying to be the bearer of bad news. I just want to bring the kind of the honesty and science side, that the data side, and that we just don't know enough. It's way too early. Some of these things, again, are suggestions, but we have a long way to go. But that means there's a lot of great work to do. It's very exciting, and I agree. I think there'll be different ratios of these. There'll be different applications of specific ones in different areas of medicine. But we've got a lot of work to do. But that's going to, again, be part of the fun here.
Well, I think that sobriety is really important because, you know, if we've learned anything over the past decade of the cannabis industry is there does tend to be a lot of irrational exuberance, early excitement that drives perhaps investments in markets that are still too premature or unfounded by science. And I think with the minor cannabinoids in particular, I think we would all be wise to make sure that our enthusiasm is matched by affirmation by science in this space. I will say, just from some of the conversations that we've been having, one that seems to have piqued quite a lot of interest, and the science still has to bear this out, is this idea of cannabis and its potential or THCV and its potential applications in the appetite suppression, weight loss ecosystem. Only because I think, one, that runs quite counter to the common cultural stereotype of cannabis and the munchies. But also, two, while the medical or therapeutic applications related to diseases, whether they range from cancers to pain, etc., there's a lot of, broadly speaking, cannabis and cannabinoid research happening in that space. I actually have not seen a lot of research aimed at this aspect of weight loss, managing obesity, and given where the US currently is in its epidemic proportions of obesity, if this does bear out, if this bears fruit, I think that's beyond the existing pharmaceutical ecosystem that a lot of cannabis is being explored for, an entirely new angle that could represent potentially very lucrative opportunities. So a lot of science to be done, but always interesting or fascinating to see the number of threads that cannabis seems to show promise for.
I think that application has great potential, and the sooner we can figure out which part of the plant causes the munchies and which causes the opposite, the better. But I agree with you, and I've seen that, and but we've got to figure that out, and still ways to go, but huge application.
So then maybe a final question on this slide, which I think dovetails well with the next one, which is the regulatory status of these minor cannabinoids. One of the questions that we got from our attendees was, you know, they're concerned that, say, something like THCV, the variants, are going to be regulated the same way as THC would be, so being viewed as analogs. Could you speak to that? You know, these minor cannabinoids generally aren't explicitly referenced in regulations, but if they're precursors, if they're the variants, do they fall under the same governing regulations, or is this a much less regulated ecosystem, allowing innovators to explore these cannabinoids in ways that you might not necessarily explore THC or CBD?
Our take on current language is that Delta-9 is the only scheduled cannabinoid. In fact, the CSA, the Controlled Substance Act, was modified due to the Farm Bill, now redefining what hemp and marijuana are, and it's based purely on that 0.3% less or more of Delta-9. John, do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the one that all of the regulatory language has been, Delta-9 is the compound that all the regulatory language has been developed around currently.
And fully decarboxylated as well, the total of the AAN.
It is, and I think as the language exists today, I think that's right. I think I think that the challenge is that there are some arguments around, if you just measure Delta-9 THC, it's really a chemical conversion of the acid form, or THCA,
right,
down to THC. And so, I think it starts to get into a bit of a gray area, and has certainly caused a lot of heartburn in the industry. And from a scientific perspective, you know, I would argue that, you know, that the limit should be higher. You know, I think there's a movement out there for around 1% THC. And I think the reality is that given the interconnection of these biological pathways within the plant, it gets very hard to produce things like CBD, some of these other cannabinoids, or even the terpenes that are highly valued in this plant without producing, you know, somewhere in the, you know, 0.5% range of THC. It gets challenging.
That's a great point. But I guess from what we've just said, then anything other than THC or TCA is non-controlled. That's our take. And John K, do you agree?
Yeah, so we actually consulted an attorney in advance of this webinar to try and answer that question, because I didn't want to put a foot wrong. And he's been studying the space for a number of years, and he had the same assessment. Basically, the assessment is, unless explicitly stated, we should continue to view these minor cannabinoids as unregulated. I think a really important point here for industry stakeholders is do very closely monitor the way these conversations are happening within the regulatory class at both the state and at the national level. You know, one would fully expect that as investment into these minor cannabinoids grows, somebody is going to try and put some bounds around it. And so if you want to ensure that there continues to be flexibility and agility to explore these without the same sort of burdens that you face with THC, now is a really important time to ensure that you're advancing or supporting regulations that allow that flexibility.
Yeah, there's one thing I'd like to add to this really quick. I mean, you know, when you look at the cannabinoid compounds as a class, you know, obviously THC is controlled, as we just talked about. CBD was positioned in a pretty peculiar way. It got caught in, you know, it was part of a new drug application or investigational new drug in Epidiolex, and that was before the Farm Bill was passed. Then the drug was approved, and the Farm Bill was passed, which made hemp legal, which is where CBD, you know, primarily comes from. And so it was caught in this pretty interesting limbo. And so while it's not prohibited in the way that THC is, due to its, you know, which is psychoactive, there are still some, you know, some real challenges there. The interesting thing, though, about these other minor cannabinoids is they can all be produced in general in low THC cannabis or hemp, which is now federally legal to grow under the Farm Bill and produce. And so, you know, I think there's actually a really interesting opportunity for the industry to focus on taking the right steps from a regulatory perspective to develop the safety data, to, you know, to cooperate with the FDA, to work together, and to actually be able to bring these compounds to market in a different way than the way CBD and THC have been regulated. So I just want to point that out. And I think, as you mentioned, very important, stay tuned, because this is still a gray area and there's not a lot of guidance yet. And it generally takes regulatory agencies years to catch up with the industry. So, you know, I think there's still a lot of work to do around minor cannabinoids.
Another example of sort of the minor of the month or minor of the week is all of a sudden Delta 8 now getting a sort of the social media attention, and the question, is it psychoactive? And of course, Delta 8 is not Delta 9, so it's a non-controlled cannabinoid by definition. And so I think it's still too early to tell. There's people out there with experience, but it's anecdotal from what I know, but that's an interesting example. And
yeah.
Yeah. And actually, there's been a couple of questions specifically around Delta 8, so thank you for addressing that. We don't know, and have not heard affirmation yet about whether Delta 9, when isolated, is psychoactive in the way Delta 8 is psychoactive the way Delta 9 might be. But all part of the potential for research that needs to be done to gain answers to these questions. Just on screen, while we've been discussing, I put up some of the market values of the existing categories, both OTC and prescription pharmas, for just the 6 applications of some of these minor cannabinoids that we've been talking about. And collectively, they represent, just in the US, nearly a $75 billion market opportunity. Not necessarily saying that these minor cannabinoids represent a $72 billion market opportunity, but rather, when you talk about taking a couple of percentage points of cannibalization from each of these sectors, these become really big numbers relatively quickly. So part of the interest that is driving this is that the markets which these minor cannabinoids could be potentially applied toward domestically and globally are substantial. And I think that's partly what's fueling this interest.
Dr. Vaught, do you know anything about the history of 0.3? And I loved your point about going up to 1% and allowing a greater expression of some of these other cannabinoids. That's just drove me nuts in my few years involved with it. Is there a history there to the 0.3? I mean, are there any significance, or is it just as arbitrary as it seems?
As far as I can tell, and from the information I have, I think it's somewhat arbitrary. I think, I think everybody's trying to be, everybody from a regulatory perspective is trying to be conservative with cannabinoids, for wide range of reasons, but so I think that it was set as a low limit to prevent people from growing hemp legally and then converting it to some significant amount of THC and being able to sell it on the black market. So I think they, that's my guess as to why they did that. But I don't think it makes a ton of sense, and I think it certainly limits it limits farmers and growers, especially because they're the ones that have to grow this crop, and then sell it to the manufacturers and the product makers, and it gets really, really challenging. And I think at the end of the day, if somebody's growing hemp for other cannabinoids besides THC, and they're below that 1%, I think nobody's going to be able to get the psychoactive effects from that. I think it's going to be challenging. And then I also think it's it gets hard to even extract and purify it in a really meaningful way. You really have to go through some significant work to do that. So yeah, that's my take. Real quick though, back to I mean, you mentioned all these different drug markets. I think I think it's a really important point, but I also I mean, I think there's a much longer list than that even of other areas. And I think the thing that I think is really interesting is some of the other ingredient applications, like dietary supplements and food additives, because those represent huge markets as well. And I think today there's a lot of demand from consumers to take more of a proactive approach in terms of taking wellness products and supplements versus waiting until they have a severe condition that needs to be treated. So I just think it's important to note that that sector of the market is really interesting as well. And but I think I think there's applications across the board here that are really important to note. And you look at the market size, it's massive.
I totally agree.
So go ahead, Steve.
No, I just said I totally agree.
So then maybe kind of talking about, given the scale of the opportunity that we're talking about, and we completely agree, those if top six alone are nearly three-quarters of, or $75 billion potential addressable market. You add this litany of other applications and the numbers start getting dizzying very, very quickly. So what is the roadmap, the challenges that we're going to face between now and getting there? And maybe to each of you slightly different questions. One, to you, Dr. John, what are the challenges of actually breeding these cannabinoids in these plants to make their kind of capitalization, to make the processing more readily accessible? And then Steve, to you, talking about kind of the medical science of it, what are the challenges in actually getting these minor cannabinoids studied in a way that enables us to streamline or make more expedient our path to market?
Sure. So I'll take the first part on the genetics and the plant breeding side. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's really limited access to germplasm due to prohibition. And, let's face it, for 50 years, everybody bred cannabis to grow well indoors and give you a nice case of the munchies and a little bit of relaxation. But so it was really bred for its psychoactive effects and not any of these other cannabinoids. So so one of the challenges there is really access to that level of diversity. And one of the things that we've been able to do at Front Range is, we developed a partnership with the CRAG in Barcelona, which is the Center for Research, Agriculture, and Crop Genomics. And we've been able to build up a germplasm library by accessing cannabis varieties from all over the world. A lot of them are traditional hemp varieties for grain or fiber, and we're mining that diversity to look for some of these traits that have been lost in, let's say, the North American germplasm library that we have. And so I think that's one of the big challenges and one of the things we're working on. I think the other thing is really just bandwidth. When you look at something like corn, in developing the level of molecular understanding we have, first of all, it's been bred for, probably 100 years in terms of kind of modern breeding, if you will. It's taken, dozens of labs around the world, millions and millions of dollars in genomics research to really develop that level of understanding. And we're really just scratching the tip of the iceberg in terms of cannabis genomics. And part of that is because of that lack of breeding, right? You need diversity to really develop the bioinformatics that you need to understand the genome very well. And so, a lot of people think of genomics as this very simple, easy thing, but it's not. It's it's a very complicated, very complicated thing to look at. And so, so I think those are the two main points: is that it's limited access to diversity, and then I think there's also a limited amount of data and work so far. But we're fixing that. We're fixing it quickly. Our group and other groups around the world, we're developing the tools, we're doing the breeding, we're doing the genomic analysis and the sequencing work to get us there. And so, we're making a lot of progress, but I'd still say that there's a ways to go. Plant breeding takes time, right? You have to cross the plant, make babies, select the winners, do it again and again and again and again. And so, even with a fast cycle plant like cannabis, it can take years to uncover or to develop some, very minor trait and make it a major trait that's overly expressed.
So great overview on the challenges on getting it out of the crop. Steve, could you talk about kind of the challenges with advancing the science around this, the medical research around this?
So as John mentioned, and we support this as well, there's going to be different uses and different levels. The wellness and dietary supplement pathway has its own regulatory challenges, frankly, and we see significant opportunity there. But on the other hand, something that plays to our strength, the medical side and scientific side, we see, again, a significant opportunity. I mean, heretofore, Epidiolex is really the only cannabinoid drug that's FDA approved in any wide use. There's a few other ones like Sativex, which is GW's other drug. But the challenge to get anything approved at an FDA level is 11 to 15 years and millions of dollars. That's a long pipeline, a very expensive one. And certainly, again, GW has kind of set the standard in this space. So there's limited players in that, but it ties in now with the federal government's switch with the DEA that, again, soon to be announced, but where now there'll be federally approved and legal cannabis bulk manufacturers that can supply other manufacturers. And so this, again, this whole thing is intended to advance the science of cannabinoids and lead to more FDA approved medicines. And so it's not the only way. It's a very expensive pathway. We're excited to be part of that as it rolls out, but we also support and believe that there'll be uses in other outlets like dietary and wellness as well. But all of it ties into, we need more science, data, research, clinical trials.
Yeah, I I want to echo that. I mean, I think that's, it's really, really important. And I think, one of the things that we're trying to do is help mobilize the industry to recognize that, we may not all agree with the motives or the way the FDA or even other regulatory agencies work. I mean, that's typical. Generally, most people don't like rules, and that's just the way it is. But I'm really trying to mobilize people to understand what the real challenges are and the roadblocks there, and to go out and generate this data. Go run these studies. Do your diligence, understand the process. Being a biotech entrepreneur and building companies in space for a long time, a couple of things I learned early on from some of my mentors is, hey, if you want to take a drug to market, you need $1 billion and you need a decade. If you want to take a molecular diagnostic to market, you probably need $70 to $80 million and you need 5 to 6 years. And I think the companies out there in the industry as a whole really needs to recognize that, there's this gray area, and we went from something that was prohibited and illegal to something that's now kind of legal, and we're trying to develop a regulatory framework. But the reality is we still have to follow the rules that came before us, and there's opportunity to change some of that, but we still have to generate the right safety data. We need to understand the regulatory considerations to take these things to market and make sure they're safe for consumers, and make sure that, if you're going to make certain claims, that you're marketing the right kind of product. So I think that's really important. There's really an opportunity for the industry to step up, and show the FDA, hey, we hear you. We can pull together the right safety studies and follow the regulations for some of these different pathways to take products to market.
So a couple of housekeeping things. One, for our attendees, please continue to put your questions into the Q&A panel. We've been getting some great questions in. I've been reading a few of them in as we've gone along, but please continue to submit your questions for our two phenomenal panelists. Second, given the number of questions that we have, for our attendees, our speakers will avail themselves for an extended session. So we will be doing, as we've done in our previous webinars, our extra time. So following the top of the hour, we'll stay on for an additional 20 to 25 minutes just to make sure we can get through as many questions as we can. So don't worry if we haven't had a chance to get to one of your questions yet. We will be adding on some additional time. Our speakers have been very gracious and agreed to stay on for the extra time. So we will go an additional 20, 25 minutes after the top of the hour. I will close out the session with showing you the audience poll questions at the top of the hour, but we will make sure to leave that additional time to make sure we can get through as many of these terrific questions as we can. And the recording will include the full 90 minutes. So you've both kind of talked about, in different ways, the challenges with doing this with a plant. The challenges of amplifying these cannabinoids at scale, particularly those which have been bred out in this rush to breed psychoactivity in the North American genetics. So I'd love to kind of talk about maybe two aspects to this tension that's emerging between whole plant extract and isolated cannabinoids, and then the synthetics versus the naturally produced cannabinoids. I feel like I'm starting to get caught in what feels like a crossfire between people who are sitting on different sides of these markets. Those who are trying to replicate cannabinoids synthetically versus using yeast or using other approaches, versus those who are trying to get them out of the plant, as well as a parallel debate happening between people who are working with isolated cannabinoids versus those who are dealing with whole plant extracts. Kind of putting that in the context of the minor cannabinoid conversation, I'd love your perspectives or how you're each thinking about those debates and what that might mean for particularly the advancement of minor cannabinoid science moving forward.
We talked about this in our warm-up session. Somehow big pharma and synthetic are two themes that are just, sounds like the devil to these discussions sometimes. And I'm not a fan of either one, but this is definitely kind of the elephant in the room that needs to be thrown out there. I don't think either of those are inherently bad, but they both could have a role, but it certainly doesn't have to be, either of those don't have to be mutually exclusive with the success of cannabis and its advancements.
Yeah, that's a I think it's a great way to kick this off. I mean, I think as the organic chemists in the room here, the reality is I hear this a lot, like, oh, it's a chemical, or it's this. The reality is everything's chemical. Everything, from furniture, your carpet, your skin, everything's made of chemicals to the things that we consume. At a chemical level, whether something's made enzymatically or synthetically, it can certainly have, trace byproducts, in terms of the purification process. You can get byproducts from enzymatic or biological production, or you can get byproducts in synthetic production. And so it really boils down to how purified they are, and then you can't tell the difference between the two if they're at high purity, right? You can't tell the difference. THC that's produced in the lab versus THC that gets extracted from the plant is still THC. It's still going to have the same effect. So I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that that inherently, I think, as you mentioned, Steve, these are not bad things or good things. It's just science. These compounds are made in different ways. I think the way I think about this is I look at it from a supply chain perspective. And as we've talked a little bit about the different regulatory pathways and ways to take certain ingredients to market in human applications or even animal applications, when you think about, purity and things like that, if you're talking about a drug, drugs have very, very strict rules, and rightly so, for how they're manufactured, levels of purity and things like that, right? And so a lot of times you can actually achieve much higher purity of a single compound with synthetic chemistry, or even enzymatic, fermentation or synthetic biology, if you will. You can achieve higher purity. If you're looking at things like dietary supplements and food additives and wellness products, a lot of those are generally like plant extracts and are botanicals. And so, even if you could produce them in a synthetic pure way and then mix them back together to match it up, it's not what the market's looking for. And I don't know that it has the same level of efficacy from a wellness or supplement perspective, right? And note the difference between that and a therapeutic that's actually treating disease. So I think there's rationale for both sides. I think in terms of the synthetic biology question, it's a tough thing to do. I mean, people have spent hundreds of millions of dollars in developing synthetic biology systems to produce different compounds. Cannabinoids and terpenes are inherently toxic to most of the microbes that you use. So I think there's some real scientific challenges. I think they can probably be solved, and I think they'll be extremely relevant for producing purified ingredients, for especially for things like drugs. But I think on the flip side of that, the plant is a really cheap and easy way to produce these things right now, and you can extract it and purify it. And I think the other nice thing about the plant side of production is that it's going to help boost our agricultural sector in the United States, which I think is really, really important. Farming is a dying art. It's a dying industry in a lot of ways. And I think it's important to give farmers opportunities like this. At the end of the day, they're feeding us all. And I think a lot of people forget about that. We take it for granted that we just go into the store and buy our groceries, and but there's some farmer that's working hard to produce that food. And I think there's a huge economic opportunity to develop the plant side of this story as well, so that farmers have the ability to take part in this exciting new market, and it's not dominated by the other side.
So let me, great point there, Dr. John. Let me pause you there. We're at the top of the hour, so for those who might not be able to stay for extra time, I do at least want to show the poll results before we end the first period of our results, of our conversation. And so the poll results should be appearing on your screen right now. First question, which sectors of hemp industry are you currently involved? The overwhelming majority of you are involved in cannabinoids, with about 10% each involved in grain and fiber. Makes sense, given that this is a conversation about minor cannabinoids. Where in the value chain are you involved? Interestingly, about half of you are involved in retail sales, with about 1 in 3 involved in either cultivation, processing, and distribution, with 20% involved in genetics. So a good representation here of the entire supply chain, though I think a higher representation of retail stakeholders than we've had in past sessions. Third question, what area of the cannabis industry has the most growth potential over the next 5 years? Minor cannabinoids take the lead at 44%, which I think is really interesting. I think that's a stronger showing than we had expected. CBD coming in second at 31%, THC only at 11%. So clearly this is a group of true believers in the potential that minor cannabinoids could represent in the future. I was really struck by this. On which of the following, question 4, which of the following minor cannabinoids are you familiar with? CBG at 81%, CBN at 74%. Clearly, some of this is as some of you have been paying close attention to these spaces, and the fact that 50% of you or more were familiar with at least one of these minor cannabinoids is an impressive showing that if it took us a century to get oriented to THC, it's taken us a handful of years to get. We're currently at about 85% of Americans are familiar now with CBD. I suspect that the learning curve for these minor cannabinoids will be similarly compressed once we begin to commercialize them. And then, how likely are you, for the final question, how likely are you to pursue opportunities with minor cannabinoids in the next 12 months? 55% say is somewhat or very likely to pursue opportunities in the next 12 months, and 1/5 of you, 21%, are already working with these minor cannabinoids. So maybe to Dr. Dorn's point about people needing to invest in the research and advance their science, seems like there's already folks who are who are already working on it, and quite a few of you are ready to roll your sleeves up, which I think presents strong opportunity for the market. So thank you for answering those questions. I think really illuminating. Before we get back to the discussion and answering the audience, your attendees' questions, I'll put up our panelists' contact information. But I do, before we want to close, want to thank Steve Groff and the Groff North America team for sponsoring this series. The discussion across these 3 webinars, I think, has not only been illuminating and fascinating, but from the feedback we've been receiving, has really helped advance the understanding and understanding of not just the opportunities, but from stakeholders who've told me that from these conversations, they better understood where they might be able to play. So Steve and team, thank you for being such great partners through these conversations. And thank you everyone who has been able to join us across these series. We did produce a report specifically focused on cannabinoids. You can download the free copy at newfrontierdata.com/equio. And so thank you for attending, and please access this report. It covers much of the themes that we have been exploring over this 3-webinar series. So with that, I'd like to get back to the discussion and now start digging into some of our audience questions, which I think have been great. And Steve, the first one is actually for you. It was from an attendee who was asking, which of the minor cannabinoids are you going to be focusing on in your antimicrobial research?
All of them. We're going to look at a variety of them. That's what we've, I don't want to go into all detail, but we're have a number of cohorts and approaches.
Okay, fair enough. So we most strongly associate kind of the psychotropic effects with THC, or with delta-9 THC. Have either of you heard of other minor cannabinoids having similarly psychotropic effects. May manifest slightly differently, but wondering if there's been any initial kind of science around psychoactivity with minor cannabinoids in the way we've seen it with THC.
I'd like to take a stab at this. So a good friend of ours, Dr. Jan Slosky, is head of cannabis research in Alberta, in Edmonton. And he talks about CBD and THC both being psychoactive. THC, however, also having more of a narcotic function as well. And when he first said that to me, I sort of quickly disagreed with him. And the more I've studied CBD and some work done on things like social anxiety disorder, where it's one of the papers where CBD was shown to have a medical effect. It helped with the anxiety, which essentially is a psychoactive component. And so that perspective is quite interesting and somewhat contradictory to what is out there in mainstream, but I tend to agree with him. And I think, that alone is an interesting aspect, let alone some of the other minors. Delta 8 has been spoken of as being psychoactive as well. But
yeah, I would agree with that. I actually think it's a really important point. It gets back to the theme here about, collecting the data and really understanding what's going on. I mean, the reality is that, the endocannabinoid system has receptors throughout the body. And we really just, we have some level of understanding of it, but it hasn't been widely studied like a lot of other, receptors. And so anyways, I think, I think that's actually a really important point. And these cannabinoids, while they may not be psychotropic or have this narcotic type effect, they could still be psychoactive and and modulate things related to depression, mood, sleep, all of these different things that are really driven by things that are happening in the brain.
for my clinical practice, and I see up to 50 people a week for certification in Pennsylvania's medical cannabis program at the front line. Pennsylvania is only one of 4 states of the 33 that include anxiety as a qualifying condition. And when they first did that, many of us sort of were a little concerned. Obviously a very subjective thing, but I have to tell you that, and obviously COVID has exacerbated this somewhat, by far anxiety, and I guess we shouldn't be surprised, is the most common sort of requested indication for the card. But what I can also tell you is, now having seen folks, the anti-anxiety effects of cannabis on a clinical basis, to me, are one of the most important and potentially valuable aspects of this. And it's kind of get snickered at, but it's been incredible. These people are getting off their Ativan, Ambien, their pile of other meds, and I see this week after week. They come back for recertification, and it's incredibly exciting. So from my standpoint, anxiety and potentially depression and maybe bipolar treatment, but the anxiety is a huge opportunity.
I can't let that one go, Dr. Groff, because I think that's actually really important. I'd love to just kind of share some of your patient experiences or patient stories about what you've seen in their transition from the prescribed medications to cannabis for anxiety. Given this kind of epidemic of anxiety that we're seeing, particularly in response to this pandemic, I think this has been one of the catalysts, we think, for why we've seen the surge in demand for cannabis, even in recreational markets or adult use markets. So I'd love to hear what you've been hearing from your patients as they've made that transition, particularly from those who have made the transition for the first time.
Well, it's, again, from a traditional medical standpoint, I was kind of a skeptic throughout my career, and over the last couple of years, obviously that's changed considerably. I've been doing this for about 2 years, and again, on the front line with certification and following up with folks who are using medical cannabis here in Pennsylvania. A good portion of these folks are very familiar with it and had been using it, so they're looking to get a card to be legal, and understandably, but they know that it helps them. And then there's a bunch of folks who are on a pile of other psychiatric meds prescribed by their standard physician. That physician doesn't support use of cannabis, and they visit us and we certify them, and we see them back weeks, months later, a year later for their research. And they're off all their prescription meds. They're using cannabis. They're sleeping better. Their interaction with their family is better. And so, again, as a former traditional physician, I find myself now a complete advocate for more science, but I'm seeing it even at this sort of inexact, where we're using flower, we're talking about the entourage effect, meaning we don't know exactly what's happening, but I'm seeing enough that, again, encourages me to want to study this further and develop business in it further. But I see it at that front line where even that entourage effect is having incredible changes in people's lives. And again, something like anxiety is a human condition that's rampant right now. So that gives me a whole lot of passion to keep pushing this forward. So.
It's great. It's great. Dr. John, a couple of questions for you. One of our attendees is asking if you could repeat the name of the Barcelona Research Institute that you're working with. And then two, what were the names of the CBG strains that you put out into market this year?
Yeah, definitely. So the crag, and actually just send it over in the chat room, but the crag and IRTA, they're actually two connected but separate kind of research centers in Barcelona that we've been working with for almost 2 years now. And they're focused on plant biotechnology and plant breeding. They work in a lot of different crops. The two varieties that we brought to market this year in collaboration with other groups was a variety called Kagia. And this actually came out of the University of Valencia research and a program there in Spain, and a group called Hemp Trading that was a high CBG variety. And then there was another variety that we worked with U.S. Nursery called Pure CBG. And I think it's still very early in growing any of these hemp varieties all over the world. And so we're excited to see the results this year.
I'll revisit just as a point of personal assessment, something that we were talking about just before the break, which was this dichotomy between the pharmaceutical and the synthetic versus the whole plant and the plant derived. And to this point of where the industry is going, I think looking at the THC market or the marijuana market in its conventional sense might give us some appreciation for the scale of existing opportunity and where this might be headed. So based on New Frontiers analysis, we estimate that today the global demand for marijuana in its flower-based form, because most people smoke it, is about $350 billion. And that opportunity, that demand, is unlikely to be dramatically disrupted by the ingress of new, whether they're isolated cannabinoids or synthetically produced products. If anything, we view that the ingress of these new product formulations, the isolates, the distillates, the synthetics, are all going to be additive, not detractive. And so, we think there's going to be a market where these things coexist. I don't think this is going to end up being a binary market. It may be a little more fragmented in the isolated minor cannabinoid ecosystem, but I think the fact that people have been consuming marijuana in its most kind of natural form as a dried, combusted plant. Innovation will change the way we consume it. We're already seeing that with the way that the share of flower is transitioning to edibles, infused products, topicals, etc. But I don't think this ends up being an either or. I don't think this ends up being a zero-sum game where one side wins over the other. And even as the plant innovation grows, as we better understand the genetics, I think that is going to be supplemented by innovation around how to replicate these cannabinoids at scale that create a sum that's much larger than its individual parts and creates a sum that's much larger than the existing market as we currently know it. So that's my 2 second or 2 minute soapbox, but I'd love a response from either of you doctors if you have a thought or reaction to that.
I think, like we've been saying throughout, there's multiple pathways, and I totally agree. And there's no reason we can't pursue more specific cannabinoid uses and formulations, and doing that doesn't reduce the benefits and the opportunity to use flower and use more the entourage effect. And I see that up front personally. I mean, with patients, and I totally agree.
Yeah, but I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, you know, I think this is a really exciting plant. I think it's been around for well over 10,000 years with, you know, some form of use or consumption in different ways. It's incredibly safe. I mean, even if you look at the limited safety data around CBD and the Epidiolex trials, you know, in very sick populations of people, it's very safe from what we've seen.
There's no lethal dose of marijuana.
Yeah. It's one of the few quote chemicals in the world that, you know, that there is no lethal dose. I think that's a really great point. I mean, you know, something like caffeine or even alcohol, I mean, these things have lethal doses that are, you know, within, you know, 1 to 2 orders of magnitude of your normal consumption dose, right? You know, and cannabis is thought to be, you know, over 10 or 20,000 times, you know, the normal consumption dose, but it still has never been actually proven as lethal. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. You know, and I think there's still a lot of work to do to support that in a you know, a clinical fashion and with the right level of scrutiny to the data and validation, so that, you know, you can get the support of regulatory bodies like the FDA and doctors and scientists and you know, experts around the world. But I think, you know, if we can generate that data, it clears out that bar. But this plant has the ability to produce, you know, so many interesting things. I mean, you know, the cannabinoids are a big group, and I think there's recreational applications, you know, and I think in terms of there's dietary supplement wellness applications and there's drug applications. I think there's even veterinary and pet applications. And I think, you know, if you really look at the market as it exists today, because of prohibition, you know, I don't know what the numbers are. I've heard like, you know, 10% or 15% of the US population, you know, may use cannabis in one form or another. But as you mentioned, John, as the technology grows and develops for different and more controlled modes of consumption versus, you know, taking a bong hit or smoking a joint, right, which is the way it's been traditionally consumed, I think you're going to see adoption, you know, by, you know, other groups of people.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So there's a huge untapped market out there, I think, that it's really exciting to think about as well. So that's my take.
So given that we're about 20 minutes past, maybe for our penultimate question, talk a bit about the future of these minor cannabinoids. And because this is the end of the series, maybe I'll even expand it a bit more than that. The future of cannabis writ large. What do you think are some of the major changes that we should expect to see over the next 2 to 5 years? And for you personally, each, what excites you the most about what's coming down the pike?
I don't know. Who wants to break out the crystal ball?
Yeah. Throw a couple things out.
We will reconvene here in 3 years and stress test how accurate we were with these. Please.
I certainly think there's going to be more widespread adoption, and I look in my own small universe of patients and sort of the clinical interaction, and I've just been astonished by the expansion and into groups that you wouldn't typically expect that, and then they quickly realize how their quality of life is improved, and it begins to spread through even a community. And again, we're talking about even non-specific entourage effect type medicine. So I'm excited by that, but yet think about the sort of limitless future of other applications of specific molecules and formulations. So and now being involved in industry the way we are, the opportunity we have for bulk manufacturing, it just is tremendously exciting. And talking with someone like Dr. Vaught, I look forward to catching up with him and discussing a bunch of great ideas. So this is fun.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Groff. That's yeah, we're excited to talk more about that as well. I couldn't agree more with everything you said. I mean, I think there's the medical, the ingredient side of this, the whole cannabinoid story. But I also want to point out that there's industrial applications, there's protein applications. I mean, plant-based protein is one of the hottest areas in the food sector, and replacing protein sources, meat sources, dairy, all of it. And hemp grain is a very, very interesting protein. It's got a balanced amino acid profile. It's got omega-6s and omega-3s that are balanced the way they are in the human body, which is actually kind of rare. They've got other phytonutrients. And I think with some breeding and then some development of the hemp grain supply chain, I think it could compete with things like soy and other pea protein, for example. I think there's ways to grow this plant cleaner, right? It's naturally pest resistant, so we can grow it without pesticides, for example. So I think there's huge opportunity there. I think there's also industrial applications of hemp, right? People are already using it. I've seen all kinds of amazing applications, from bulk ingredients to building materials like plywood and composite materials, to high strength fibers, to even nanoscale fibers to support nanoscale circuits and other things in new battery applications. So it's pretty exciting. And I think from a crop perspective, in the agricultural side, it's such an exciting crop to work with because it can do all these amazing things. It produces such incredible chemical diversity all within one plant. One thing we didn't even talk about today, but was, there's all kinds of interesting things produced in the root of this plant, right? It's been around in Chinese medicine for a few thousand years using the root. So anyways, we're really just scratching the tip of the iceberg. So, I expect to see all of these different segments of the industry progress, but it's going to take a lot of work. I mean, there's, you got to develop the supply chain. You've got to get through the different regulatory hurdles. And so, I think we'll continue to see a lot of changes, over time. But, I think the most important thing is we've got to work together to fix some of the regulatory hurdles that continue to restrict the science, the research, and the development of these products. And I think we can start to clear some of those. I think we're going to begin to see the industry continue to flourish.
Drop the mic with that, man. Amen.
I'm just excited to see what you guys are going to be doing over the next 3 to 5 years.
That was great. That was just great.
There's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, for sure.
Couldn't agree more.
So, I think that's a perfect note on which to end this. I'm going to put back up just on screen. Somebody had requested to see our panelists' face, which is why I stopped sharing our screen. But I'm going to put back just so everyone can see the contact information for our 2 esteemed panelists today.
The one thing I was going to point out, I don't know how it happened, but we've got Ben at drink recess or something. I can't quite see the other side of it. I don't know who that is, but it's not me.
Do not email Dr. John to Ben at drink recess. Let me fix that very, very quickly. But even as we do that, I would like to thank our just panelists for this terrific conversation that we've had today. And actually, let me just change it in real time. If you can give me your email address, John, I'll put it in as we speak.
It is jvaught@frontrangebio.com.
That's a pretty easy one. Okay, great. and you should be able to see my screen now.
Perfect. That's much better.
There you go. To our panelists, John, Steve, thank you. I think this has been a phenomenal discussion. I see we've been receiving some great feedback from our attendees already. So thank you for sharing your perspectives. For our attendees who are still on, thank you for running through this overtime with us. I hope you have found this to be a valuable conversation. We will be, to John's point, talking about the immense applications of the plant. We will be beginning in about 3 weeks a new series focused on fiber and the fiber applications of the hemp plant. So we'll be getting those dates finalized here shortly. Look out for an invitation to that series coming up in the next week or so. But again, to Dr. Groff and the team, thank you for being sponsors, not just of this webinar, but of this 3-part series. Thank you for the phenomenal perspective that you've brought, and we are terrifically excited to see the science that you're going to be advancing under this federal licensing permit. Congratulations on that authorization, and congratulations we're terrifically excited to see what's going to come from this.
Thank you. So are we.
If you are interested in the report that was produced around this, you can access the report on hemp cannabinoids, as well as every other report that New Frontier has produced over the past 6 years at newfrontierdata.com/equio. It's free for a 7-day trial if you're not already a member. If you are already a subscriber, you should have access to this and the upcoming 5-year report, as well as the rest of the reports we'll be producing on these series. So with that, we are pleased to conclude this 3-webinar series on hemp cannabinoids. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for a terrific conversation. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar series focused on hemp fiber. In the interim, do take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Thank you very much.